Open your Bibles, please, with me to Daniel chapter 12. We come to the concluding remarks of Daniel in chapter 12. And as Daniel, the revelation of God to Daniel wraps up, you also get the sense that God is showing us how this age wraps up. And there's several indications of that it's dealing with the end times and dealing with how God brings it all to a conclusion. Daniel has been given a front row seat on God's revelation as to how that's going to happen, and various information, and again, layer by layer. Early on in the book, it was high overview information. As time goes on, it gets down in more detail as layers go on. And we pointed out that in chapter 11, the word shall is used well over 100 times, used 2 or 3 times in every verse. And it just reminds us that God says this shall happen, and then that shall happen, and then this king shall do that, and then this king shall overrule him, and well over 100 times. I think it was 130-ish. And just reminds us how that we can rest in the Lord and rest in the reality that He has all things under control, though many times it doesn't seem like it. He does. But sometimes things seem out of control. Sometimes in our own personal world, sometimes in our country, sometimes in the whole globe of people. It just seems like sometimes things are out of control. But it's all within the divine providence of God. He's moving and He's working and He's restraining. And whatever doesn't bring Him glory, He restrains. And that's true at the end times. And there's so much that goes on. And Daniel's being briefed on how God wraps it up. And he starts chapter 12 by saying, and at that time. So we see from the very first word of the first verse there, and it's a continuation of what we've been seeing in chapter 11. And it just carries the thought on, at that time. So at what time? At that time, what is he having reference to? I believe he's having reference to the portion of Scripture that we looked at last time we were together, from verse 36 to the end of the chapter, that seems to be dealing with really the end of the age. It seems to be dealing with the tribulation and all that goes into that battle, the great battle to end the age. It seems to be at that time. He says in verse 35 that there will be, it's a time of purging. In verse 35, some of them understanding shall fall to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. So we see that it has indications that it's the wrap up. During that wrap up, there's those that will be purged and made white. There's going to be great tribulation. There's going to be those that come through that. There are going to be those that don't come through it as martyrs, and they're willing to give their lives to the Lord, for the Lord. And it's a time of purging, but the sense of it is it's a time of wrapping up. We'll be aware of that as we're going through this text. Verses 36 and 37 of chapter 11. And the king shall do according to his will. So we've been introduced to this king. We've been the Antichrist. And he exalts himself. He magnifies himself above every god. And shall make speak marvelous things against the God of gods. And shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. For that that is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. We looked at this last week, that at that time, it is a time when he will put everything else to second place or below in his life, but the main thing is to magnify himself above all, there in verse 37. In verse 40, at that time of the end, and see that language just seems to permeate this text. At that time of the end, shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, and with horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall enter the countries, and shall overflow and pass over. There in verse 40, we see it's a whirlwind of widespread war. And again, we're going to run into this phrase in our text in chapter 12, verse 1, a time like no other. Verse 41, he shall also enter into the glorious land. He will even have the gall to enter into the Jewish land, the land of their pilgrimage. And it'll be a time of that. Verse 44, there'll be tidings out of the east and out of the north that shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy, and utterly to make away many. And so it's a time of great fury, of destruction. And again, from our text in verse 1, a time of trouble such as never was, nor ever will be again. So again, it has that flavor of culmination, of wrapping up. Verse 45, there at the very beginning, he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas of the glorious holy mountain. And so he even seeks to hijack proper worship. That's the time, I think, that we're in chapter 12, verse 1, when he says, and at that time. It is truly a time like no other. That is in this text, in chapter 12, verse 1. At that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And so I want to continue on the thought. We'll come back and catch some of the language there, but I want to continue on that time. That time of great destruction, at that time of the Antichrist, magnifying himself above all others, above every other normal desire. His sole goal is to exalt himself above everything, everyone, every god, just exalt himself. And at that time, there's going to be, he has the ability to do, well, we read that he makes war with the saints and prevails. And that's hard for us to comprehend, but it is that kind of time, that time like no other. Remember when we were studying the book of Revelation, as all of this was heating up, and then you have the Lord beginning to pour out his rightful wrath, his just indignation upon rebellious man and all those that oppose him. And the clash, the culmination of that, the Battle of Armageddon. And again, all of that has a flavor of seeming like it's wrapping up. At that time shall Michael stand up. And it's going to be a time, in the middle of verse 1, a time of trouble such as never was. I want to carry on that thought just a little bit back in the Gospels. Matthew chapter 24. I don't know why I said back to the Gospels, but in the Gospel, Matthew chapter 24, I want to notice verse 21, and how does the Lord seem to deal with this time period. Matthew 24:21, he says, "For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time. No, nor ever shall be. So the Lord, in his personal ministry, indicated that there would be a time that was like no other time. And our text seems to put that at the end of the age. Revelation certainly seems to put that at the end of the age. As we were getting done with the book of Revelation, we had several messages on how that this was the end, this was the conclusion, this was the wrap-up. And it came after that this time of great tribulation, like there never was before, nor ever shall be. A parallel verse in Mark 13, Mark chapter 13, there's a couple words different, and I want you to notice how Mark records this. Mark 13 and verse 19, the Lord's words are recorded this way in Mark, "For in those days shall be thy affliction, such as was not from the beginning of the creation which God created unto this time, neither shall be." So it's destruction, it's calamity, it's war, it's affliction, it's great tribulation. Now, we read this and we get the Lord saying it, and Matthew and Mark recording it very parallel with slight nuance differences in how they remembered it, how they recorded it, the words that they use. And we look at those things and we say this was a time like no other. And then you have to stop and think about that. You have to stop and ponder that. A time like no other. You can go back in your mind and you can remember things like the Holocaust and so many million Jews exterminated. And you say, not even close. Remember when we were going through the various trumpet judgments and the various judgments of God, and there would be, it seemed like one after another, where a third of the earth would be destroyed, a third of the population would be destroyed, a huge number of animals, plants, and ecosystems and people destroyed. And so it's on a much larger scale than even as horrible as the Holocaust was. Way beyond that. And you even got to scratch your head a little bit and say, the global flood. The flood where every living thing that drew breath, except for that which was on the ark, died. And he says, it's going to be worse than that. Maybe not on the scale of human life lost, but just the calamity, the destruction, the chaos, the affliction, the war. That's like no other. I mean, you have to put that in context, and you say, wow. That's where many people miss, I believe, a lot of the interpretation. You'll run across that the mindset of some, in some commentaries, that put this destruction and calamity and war in AD 70, at the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. It's not nearly big enough. It's not nearly destructive enough. It's not nearly widespread and has the scope that he's talking about to plug in AD 70. Plus, AD 70 didn't wrap things. I'm talking about 70 years after Christ, and that didn't wrap things up. That didn't bring things to a conclusion. It doesn't fit all the pieces, but there are some that seem to try to put that as the tribulation and some of the details around that. And I think their thinking is too short-sighted. I think their thinking is too small. When you begin to have the full-out onslaught of Satan, the Antichrist, and all the powers of hell battling against he that rides the white horse. All the war, all the judgments that the Lord pours out as He unrolls that scroll. A time like no other, which brings an end to the age. Revelation 13 is in the midst of this, I think. Revelation 13, 3 through 8 is what we'll read. And I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed. And the world wondered after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, which gave power to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 40. There we run into that again, 40 and 2 months. That 3.5-year period. We're going to run into that not tonight, but in text going forward in Daniel. He opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme His name, His tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. Folks, something on this scope and scale has never happened. Hasn't happened yet, but it's going to happen. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, the beast, it escapes me here, the dragon, beast and the dragon, the Antichrist and Satan himself. And all that are upon the earth will worship Antichrist. Verse 8, and all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him. He has seemingly been dead and rose from the dead. A counterfeit of Christ, an antichrist. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him. Oh wait, whose names are not written in the book of life, of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. All whose names are not written, all those people that are not of God, they'll worship the beast. There's only two sides to be on. To worship Christ or to worship Antichrist. There are only two sides. Revelation 15:1, and then we'll go back to our text. Revelation 15:1, we saw from 13 the rule of Antichrist and his ability to reign and conquer and so on. Revelation 15:1, and I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues. For in them is filled up the wrath of God. And remember when we talked about these 7 last plagues. In them is the full measure of God's wrath. His righteous and proper wrath against all that rebel against Him. And this is going to come to a head. This is going to come to a clash. So back in our text, we said all that to say, and at that time, that's what we're dealing with. At that time, what's going to happen? Michael will stand up. We ran into Michael a little while back. Remember chapter 10, verse 13? But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me. Remember, Gabriel, I believe it's Gabriel, telling him that he was dispatched when he started praying, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me. And we got into that unseen warfare, that unseen spiritual warfare. And I was there 20 days. But lo, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I remained there with the kings of Persia. And so he let Daniel and he let us in on a little scene behind the scenes. But there we saw Michael, the warrior angel. And at that time shall Michael stand up. He rises to action. He gets in the battle. Throughout the scriptures you see God giving leeway, God giving parameters. We saw it in the book of Job so very clearly. Satan, you can go this far on Job, but you can't go any farther. This is what I will allow. And he gives him the parameters. This is where you have to operate. But you can't go past that. And Satan has been given some parameters in this context, in this venue. He's been given some parameters. And when that parameter has been met, when he can go no farther, then this no longer is within the plan and purpose of God, Michael stands up and says, that's enough. We're going to end this. Michael stands up. The great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. Now that gets into a lengthy discussion as well. The children of thy people. We will read in this verse those that are found written in the book. His people are written in the book. There's the last phrase of verse 1. We read just a minute ago out of Revelation 13:8 that everybody worshipped the beast except those whose names are written. They only worshipped if their names were not written. You can write this verse down. The Lord says this. Get caught up with my notes here. Luke 10:20. And he tells them, the Lord says, this is what you should rejoice in. This is what you ought to really thank the Lord for. That your names were written in heaven. I believe that's what he has reference to of thy people. And specifically the Jewish people that are going through things. The Jewish people that have been in scope and view all through this text. But in a broader context, in this very verse, he talks about those written in the book. And we read in Revelation about those, Revelation 13:8, about those who were not written in the book. And we can read, for that matter, Revelation 21 and verse 27. Revelation 21:27. And there shall in no wise enter into it anything that defileth, neither whatsoever worketh abomination, or maketh a lie, but they which are written in the Lamb's book of life. So you have in Luke 10:20, the Lord saying, this is what you rejoice in. Your name's written in heaven. The apostles had gained some human victories and they were excited, and the Lord puts it into perspective for them in that passage. It says, this is what you rejoice in. Your name's written in heaven. They didn't write it. You didn't write yours if you're saved. But that's what we rejoice in, that the Lord knew me. Before I was formed in the womb, the Lord knew me. And He had a purpose. And He talks here about Michael standing up, that great prince, which standeth for thy people. And he talks at the end of that verse about those that are found written in the book. Now, let's read verse 1. At that time shall Michael stand up, that great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered. Michael will stand up. The side of evil will be put in its place and subdued. Michael will stand up. We read in the book of Revelation, the Lord takes action as He's pouring out the judgments as he brings to an end all that oppose. And he says in this passage that thy people shall be delivered. Daniel, there's no doubt about this. There's no doubt how this thing wraps up. And that's how all the flavor of this is, that it wraps up. Verse 2, and many of them that sleep in the dust. Now some have trouble with the word many there, that sleep in the dust. It seems to me, how I understand this, that he has reference to the many that sleep in the dust in contrast to the relatively few that are on the earth at that time. Think about all of the ages of time of those that have slept, lived and died, and they now sleep in the dust. Versus all of those ages of time of all of those people that have gone on to meet their Maker in one way or the other. And that versus who's alive and are on the earth at that time. I take that as what he has reference to the many. The many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. What do you and I have? Let me ask you this differently. Do you and I have the power to rise from the dead? Do you and I have the power to rally up and rise from the dead? No, we don't have that power. We don't have that ability. But all who sleep in the dust shall awake. If you and I don't have the ability to rise up and rally up and come back to life, who does that? Who brings them back to life? And that's obviously the answer to that is God. And God brings them back to life. And He does so for a purpose. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. All through the New Testament, we have the options of everlasting life and everlasting damnation. You have those two options. There are no third option. There is no third option. There are no other categories. There is a resurrection to life, and there is a resurrection to damnation. The way that it's put in Acts 24:15, for example. Acts 24 and verse 15. And have hope toward God, which they themselves also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. All, and then again, that's the only two categories you can find in the Bible, the just and the unjust. There isn't the just and the unjust, and somewhere in the middle. There's the just and the unjust, the name's written or the name's not written. There's the just and the unjust, and we know who's the justifier, and that is Christ. We know that He does the work of justifying, that He is both the just and the justifier, we read in Romans 3. And so to rise in the resurrection to just or unjust, to be raised as just is a gift of God, in connection with your salvation. Look with me also in John chapter 5. John chapter 5. And I want you to notice with me verse 29. Notice this, verse 28. Marvel not at this, for the hour is coming, in the which all that are in the graves shall hear His voice, and shall come forth, they that have done good, unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil, unto the resurrection of damnation. Now again, you only find two categories. Those that by the grace of God have been instructed by God and taught by God and given the grace of God to live lives that are within human reason just and right and good. Not that anyone in this body, in this flesh, ever rids themselves of that old sin nature while they're on this earth. They still struggle with that sin. Romans 7, Paul's demonstrating that. But the tenor of their life is essentially good. They're striving to be good and do good, not to earn their salvation, but because God has saved them. And they that have done good unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil unto the resurrection of damnation. There are only two options. And as the age wraps up, which all of our text here in Daniel or in Revelation shows the age wrapping up, there's going to be a resurrection. Now, most of your commentaries, many of them anyway, will have a general resurrection. They miss, in my estimation, the fact that there are two judgments. One before the 1,000-year reign and one after. They miss the Bema Seat judgment that seems to take place before the 1,000 years. They miss the purpose of the Bema Seat judgment. You can read about it in 2 Corinthians 5. And the purpose of it is to review the saints and see what reward there may be. That's what Bema means, reward seat. The great white throne judgment in Revelation 20 is after the 1,000 years. It's a different judgment for a different purpose. The great white throne is indicative of the fact that he that sits on the throne is white and righteous. And the dead, small and great, come before him. And that means the dead, like Paul says it in Ephesians 2, dead in trespasses and sins. And so just be aware of the fact when you're reading about the resurrection that you'll have some commentaries that'll give you the idea of a general resurrection, and they'll have a general judgment. They're close, but they miss that different purpose at different judgments and different time frame. But there are only two options. They sleep in the dust of the earth. They shall awake. Our text, verse 2, Daniel. Some to everlasting life. Some to shame and everlasting contempt. That contempt is to be abhorrent. That the word abhorrent means to inspire disgust and loathing. And that's the only two options. Life or damnation. And again, that just sounds like you're wrapping things up when you have that kind of culminating judgment. And they shall awake. This, you understand that that the Bible describes this ongoing consciousness. You see it in Luke 16, where he tells the rich man to remember. The body doesn't, or the soul doesn't go out of existence. The body is laid aside for a period of time. But the soul doesn't go out of existence. And in Luke 16, he is in torments. And the flame is tormenting him. And he asks, have Lazarus just dip his finger in water and put a drop of water on my tongue. And Abraham says to that man in Luke 16, remember life. There is, and he just says, I don't want anything to do with that. He says, son, remember. But there is in throughout our Bibles, that resurrection. That the body just doesn't go in the grave and that's it. That's the end of it. And there's a resurrection unto life and a resurrection unto damnation. Or in our text, shame and everlasting contempt. So let's read our 3 verse. I want to get to the 3rd verse quickly and and wrap it up. Chapter 12, verse 1. And at that time, time of the end, the time of tribulation, shall Michael stand up, that great prince which standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book, and many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And they that be wise. Now again, they that be wise. Do you and I own any inherent wisdom that we can brag about? Do you and I have any inherent... The proverb says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Well, how do we learn to fear the Lord? He makes Himself real to us. He reveals Himself to us in a way where we humble before Him. They that shall be wise. They're made wise by God, being one of His. They're made wise by God. They that be wise. You see, the whole point of that is that there's nothing in salvation for you and I to boast in. We're the recipients. We trust Him and we receive grace. We're the recipients. And that's going to bear in this third verse an understanding. They that shall, and they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament. Look out in the firmament. Look out in the heavens on a clear night. Probably not tonight, but look out on a clear night. And I love to hear the stories of the guys and gals that lived in the city all their life, and they go out on vacation and go out to the country and get away from the city lights, and they just look in the sky and say, oh, wow! They're reflecting the sun. What you see, right? We're reflecting Him. That's what this is telling us. They that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. They're made wise by God. And now they reflect His glory. And they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. And I think in the context, He has specifically in mind, where remember we're in the tribulation period, where remember we had the 144,000 witnesses. I think specifically He has in reference to they that turn many to righteousness. He has that time period in mind, but it's a reminder to us that our duty is to be trying to share the gospel and tell others of how to be right in Christ and with Christ. But shining as stars forever and ever, reflecting His glory, being luminaries, shining brightly and brilliantly as God works on us and through us. And that's why we think on this passage, or while we're thinking on this passage, we're thinking on concluding things and end times, and how it wraps up. That may be, I don't think it is a long ways away, but it may be. But one thing's for certain, our time on this earth is brief. And you and I will one day stand before our Maker. And we will only stand before Him in two different manners. Forgiven, made just and right by the Lamb. Or rebellious to Him and opposed to Him and rejecting His grace and rejecting His Son. And thus, John 3:36 is where we'll close. John chapter 3. I like to read it with verse 16. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Verse 36, He that believeth on the Son hath everlasting life. And he that believeth not the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God abideth on him. And again, we find just one of many examples. There's only two options. It is our prayer tonight that as we hold up before you Christ, and as we have been trying to hold up before you the finished work of Christ upon the cross and the series of the message of the cross, that you would see Christ. You would see your need of Christ. That you would see He is your only hope. And that you would believe on Him. That you would trust Him fully. Let's stand.